They found her body stuffed inside a garbage can, still breathing, dying slowly in complete darkness while her killers ate dinner in the next room. Her name was Channon Christian. She was 21 years old. And what happened to her and her boyfriend, Christopher Newsom, over 4 days in January 2007 was so brutal, so unthinkably evil, that when I tell you the full story, you'll understand why I'm about to ask you to do something before we go any further. Because this story, this true story that happened in Knoxville, Tennessee, just 17 years ago, was buried. It was ignored. It was swept under the carpet of national consciousness while other victims became household names. And the reason why tells us something about America we desperately don't want to face. Right now, before I tell you what happened to these two young people, before I describe the evil they encountered on an ordinary Saturday night, before I walk you through 4 days of torture that will change how you see the world, I need you to do something. Share this video, subscribe to this channel, do it now. Not for me, I don't matter in this story. Do it for Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom, who can't ask you themselves anymore. Do it because they deserve to be remembered the way Natalie Holloway was remembered, the way Lacey Peterson was remembered, the way John Benet Ramsey was remembered. Do it because the media failed them, because the system tried to bury their story, because silence serves only the people who deserve to be forgotten. You owe them these minutes. We all do. Because what happened to them could happen to anyone. To your daughter, your son, your sister, your brother. To you. And when you hear the full story, when you understand what was done to them and how the world responded, you'll know why I'm asking you to share this now, while you're thinking about it, before the story carries you away and you forget. Hit that share button, subscribe, leave a comment saying you were here, that you heard their names, that you refuse to let them be forgotten. Do it for Channon, do it for Christopher, do it because in some small way it's an act of justice. Now let me take you back to January 6th, 2007. Let me show you how ordinary evil can look until the moment it reveals itself. Let me tell you about two young people in love who made the fatal mistake of believing they were safe in their own city, in their own neighborhood, on their own Saturday night. I've spent 17 years carrying this story, and it's changed me. It's changed everyone who's truly heard it, who's sat with the details long enough to understand what they mean, who's been brave enough not to look away when looking away would be so much easier. This isn't a story that lets you sleep peacefully. This isn't a story you'll forget by tomorrow. This is a story that burrows into your consciousness and sets up permanent residence, reminding you that evil isn't an abstract concept or a religious metaphor. It's a real force in the world, walking around in human skin, waiting for opportunity. Knoxville, Tennessee in early 2007 was a city of about 180,000 people, nestled in the foothills of the Great Smoky Mountains. It had that particular character of mid-sized American cities, small enough that neighborhoods felt like communities, large enough to offer the anonymity cities provide. The University of Tennessee anchored the town, bringing youth and energy and that sense of possibility that college towns radiate. It was the kind of place where people raised families, where you could walk downtown without fear, where parents sent their children to school believing they'd come home safely. It was, in other words, the kind of place where people believe tragedies happen somewhere else to someone else, in rougher cities with more obvious dangers. Knoxville wasn't Detroit or Chicago or Los Angeles. It was a southern city with southern manners. where people still said yes ma'am and no sir, where church on Sunday was routine, where the biggest news was usually Tennessee Volunteers football. Bad things didn't happen here. Not really. Not things like what I'm about to describe. Channon Christian was 21 years old that January, a senior at the University of Tennessee. Before I tell you what was done to her, before I describe the 4 days of hell she endured, I want you to know who she was when she was alive, when she was whole, when her future stretched before her full of promise and possibility. Because Channon wasn't just a victim, she was a person, a daughter, a friend, a student, a young woman with dreams and plans and people who loved her desperately. She was studying sociology with a minor in Spanish. Think about that for a moment. She was drawn to understanding how societies function, how people connect, what makes communities thrive or fracture. She wanted to help people, to make a difference, to use her education to build something meaningful. There's a bitter irony in that, isn't there? A young woman studying the bonds that hold humanity together, destroyed by people who represented the complete breakdown of those bonds. Channon had blonde hair and blue eyes, and a smile that made people feel welcomed, seen, valued. Her friends described her as fiercely loyal, the kind of person who remembered your birthday, who called when you were going through something difficult, who showed up when showing up mattered. She wasn't someone who collected acquaintances. She built real friendships with depth and commitment. She was the friend you wanted in your corner, the daughter who made her parents proud. The student professors remembered fondly. She lived with her parents, Dina and Gary Christian, in their Knoxville home. She was close with her family in a way that's increasingly rare in our modern world, where young adults often can't wait to establish independence from their parents. Channon genuinely enjoyed spending time with her mother and father. She had extended family who adored her, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins who gathered for holidays and birthdays and ordinary Sundays. She loved animals, particularly dogs, with that pure affection animal lovers understand. She had plans for graduate school, for a career in social work or counseling, for a life spent helping others navigate their struggles. She was, in every way, a young woman on the cusp of her real life beginning. College was ending. The adult world was opening up. The future was bright and full of possibility. She had no idea that she had less than a week to live. No idea that her name would become synonymous, not with her accomplishments or her kindness, but with suffering so extreme it would test the limits of human comprehension. Christopher Newsom was 23 years old, working as a carpenter. I want you to picture him clearly, not as a victim, not yet, but as a living, breathing young man with calloused hands and quiet confidence. Christopher understood the satisfaction of building things that lasted, of seeing a project through from raw materials to finished product, of doing honest work that produced tangible results. In an age increasingly dominated by digital labor and abstract productivity, Christopher worked with wood and tools and his own 2 hands. There was something fundamentally decent about that, something solid. Friends and family called him Chris. They described him as gentle despite his size and strength, as someone who didn't need to prove his masculinity through aggression or bravado. He had that quality some young men possess, where their confidence comes from knowing who they are rather than from dominating others. He was comfortable in his own skin, secure in his identity, content with his life, even though it wasn't flashy or particularly remarkable by society standards. Christopher was close with his parents, Hugh and Mary Newsom. He had siblings who looked up to him, who valued his steady presence and quiet wisdom. He had friends who trusted him, who knew they could count on him to show up when he said he would, to help when help was needed, to be exactly who he appeared to be without pretense or performance. He had dreams too, though perhaps more modest than Channon's. He wanted to start his own carpentry business eventually, to build a reputation for quality work, to make a good living doing something he loved. He wasn't chasing fame or fortune. He wasn't trying to change the world or leave some grand legacy. He just wanted to live a good life, to be a good man, to build a future with his own hands, the same way he built furniture and cabinets and home additions. There's a nobility in that kind of humble ambition, in wanting to do one thing well rather than seeking recognition or status. Channon and Christopher had been dating for a few months that winter. It was a new relationship, still in that exciting phase where you're discovering each other, where everything feels fresh and full of possibility. They'd met through mutual friends, the ordinary way people meet in college towns, through social networks and chance encounters and the natural mixing that happens when young people occupy the same spaces. Friends who saw them together said they fit naturally, that there was an ease between them that suggested something real might be developing. They weren't performing a relationship for social media or putting on a show for others. They were actually getting to know each other, building something genuine, seeing if this spark might grow into something lasting. Channon's mother, Dina, had met Christopher a few times and liked him. She saw how he treated her daughter, with respect, with genuine interest, with kindness. She thought he might be someone special, someone who could make Channon happy. She was glad her daughter had found someone gentle and decent. Saturday, January 6th, 2007, started like any other Saturday for these two young people. Ordinary, unremarkable, safe. They had no reason to suspect this would be their last day of normal life. Their last day when the future still existed. Their last day when hope made sense. The weather was typical for January in Tennessee. Cold, but not brutally so. The kind of winter day where you wear a jacket and don't think twice about going out. They made plans to do something completely normal, something thousands of young couples across America were doing. That same evening, they were going to visit a friend's apartment to watch a movie. That's it. That's the grand plan that would cost them their lives. A movie at a friend's place. The kind of low-key Saturday night activity that defines young adulthood. Casual, comfortable, completely safe. Or so they thought. Channon drove her Toyota 4Runner, a vehicle that would later become a key piece of evidence in the investigation. Christopher sat in the passenger seat. It was early evening, not late. Not the dangerous hours of night when predators traditionally hunt. They were heading to Washington Ridge Apartments on Chipman Street, a complex in a part of Knoxville that mixed working families with some rougher elements, but nothing that screamed danger. Nothing that made you think twice about visiting a friend. Nothing that would make a cautious parent tell their daughter not to go there. As they drove through the winter evening, they had no idea they were being watched. They had no idea that 5 people whose lives had led them down darker paths were about to intersect with theirs. They had no idea that their ordinary Saturday night was about to become the stuff of nightmares, that their names would be forever linked not to their accomplishments or their dreams, but to what was done to them. They talked, probably, laughed maybe, made jokes about the movie they were going to watch, discussed plans for the week ahead, engaged in the comfortable small talk of a couple still getting to know each other. Channon had no idea that in a few hours she would be praying for death to end her suffering. Christopher had no idea that by tomorrow morning his body would be found beside railroad tracks, shot and burned and discarded like trash. So they pulled into the parking area at Washington Ridge Apartments as the winter darkness settled over Knoxville. They were looking for their friend's building, oriented themselves in the complex, prepared to park and walk to the apartment where a normal evening awaited them. And that's when their world ended. That's when evil revealed itself. That's when two young people full of life and promise encountered the kind of darkness most of us spend our whole lives believing doesn't really exist. Evil doesn't announce itself with ominous music or warning signs. It doesn't look like the monsters in movies. Doesn't telegraph its presence with obvious signals we can learn to recognize and avoid. Evil looks ordinary until the moment it acts. It drives regular cars, wears regular clothes, walks through regular parking lots. Evil waits for opportunity, for the moment when circumstance and vulnerability align, for the instant when predator and prey occupy the same space. On that Saturday evening in early January, 5 people were gathered in and around a small rental house at 2316 Chipman Street in Knoxville, less than a mile from where Channon and Christopher were parking at Washington Ridge Apartments. The house was a run-down property in a neighborhood landlords had stopped caring about, where tenants came and went without much notice, where neighbors minded their own business because getting involved could be dangerous. It was the kind of place that exists in every American city, the kind we drive past without really seeing, the kind where lives are lived in the margins of society's attention, the kind where bad things can happen behind closed doors without anyone intervening. The 5 people who would destroy Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom were Lamarcus Davidson, 25 years old, the ringleader with a criminal history including robbery and weapons charges; his brother, Lettelvis Cobbins, 24, who had served time for carjacking; their friend, George Thomas, 24, with his own record of violence and theft; Vanessa Coleman, 21, the same age as Channon, who would prove that the capacity for evil isn't limited by gender; and Eric Boyd, 34, the oldest of the group, with perhaps the most extensive criminal background. I'm saying their names once here because you need to know who they were, need to understand that these weren't strangers who appeared from nowhere. That they were known criminals, people with records, people who had demonstrated their capacity for violence before that Saturday night. They were people the system had encountered and released, had punished and returned to society, had marked as dangerous but allowed to walk freely among the innocent. That's part of this story too, the question of how people with their histories were free to commit the crimes they committed. But I won't glorify them with extensive backstory or psychological profiling. They don't deserve that space in this narrative. What you need to know is this: they were gathered at that house, engaged in criminal activity, drugs probably, and planning other crimes. They were armed. They were high. They were the kind of group where the worst impulses of each individual reinforced and amplified the worst impulses of the others, creating a collective capacity for evil that exceeded what any single person might have done alone. At some point that evening, whether by design or opportunity, they spotted Channon's Toyota 4Runner. Maybe they'd been out looking for a vehicle to steal. Maybe they saw the young couple and decided they looked like easy targets. Maybe it was pure terrible chance, the kind of random intersection of trajectories that destroys lives. The exact motivations don't particularly matter. What matters is what they decided to do. The carjacking happened in the parking area near Washington Ridge Apartments. The exact sequence of events was later reconstructed through evidence, through testimony given by people trying to save their own skin, through the horrifying logic of what came after. What we know is this: Channon and Christopher were approached by multiple armed individuals. They were forced from their vehicle. Their Saturday night went from normal to nightmarish in seconds. Imagine that moment. You've just parked. You're getting ready to go watch a movie with friends. Maybe you're checking your phone, gathering your things, turning off the car. Suddenly there are people at your windows, people with guns, people with violence in their eyes and demands on their lips. Your brain struggles to process what's happening because this isn't supposed to happen here, in this parking lot in this city, to people like you. Christopher probably tried to protect Channon. Every instinct, every cultural message about masculinity and protection would have driven him to put himself between danger and the woman he cared about. He probably thought if he complied, if he gave them the car, the money, whatever they wanted, it would end. He probably believed what we're all conditioned to believe, that carjackings are about property, that if you don't resist, if you do what they say, you'll survive with a traumatic story to tell, but you'll survive. He was catastrophically wrong. This wasn't a carjacking. This was a hunting party that had found prey and decided to take their time with the kill. Both Channon and Christopher were forced into the Forerunner instead of just stealing the vehicle and leaving the victims behind, which is what happens in actual carjackings, which is what someone interested only in the vehicle would do. These 5 people made a different choice. They drove their captives to the house on Chipman Street. They brought them inside. They closed the door on a world that would never see Channon and Christopher whole again. And what happened next, over the course of the following days, represents a level of depravity that challenges our fundamental understanding of human nature. The house at 2316 Chipman Street was small, filthy, cluttered with the debris of wasted lives. Drug paraphernalia, stolen goods, the accumulated trash of people who had given up on maintaining even basic standards of living. It smelled of neglect and chemicals and human waste. It was dark, lit poorly, the kind of place where shadows gathered and terrible things could happen unseen by the outside world. This is where they brought Channon Christian. This is where they brought Christopher Newsom. This is where hell began. I need to be very careful now about what I describe and how I describe it. The complete details of what Channon and Christopher endured exist in court records, in medical examiner reports, in testimony given during trials that would occur years later. These details are so brutal, so explicitly horrifying, that recounting them all serves no purpose except to traumatize. Channon and Christopher were real people who suffered real torture. They deserve dignity in the telling of their story, even as I refuse to sanitize what was done to them. So I'll tell you what you need to know, what justice demands, what prevents this from being reduced to another forgotten crime. But I won't put gratuitously graphic images in your mind just for shock value. The truth is terrible enough without embellishment. Christopher Newsom was bound with various materials. The evidence would later show ligature marks on his wrists and ankles. He was gagged to prevent him from crying out, from calling for help, from doing anything except experiencing what they chose to do to him. He was beaten repeatedly, brutally, with evidence later showing injuries to his head, face, and body. The violence wasn't functional. It wasn't about subduing him or preventing escape. It was recreational, performative, the kind of violence that serves no purpose except the perpetrator's satisfaction. Then they raped him. Christopher Newsom, a 23-year-old carpenter, a gentle young man who worked with his hands and treated people with kindness, was sexually assaulted by at least one of his male captors. The medical evidence would confirm anal rape, would document the violation with clinical precision. Think about what that means. Not just the physical trauma, but the psychological torture of being violated in that way, of having your humanity reduced to nothing, of being treated as an object for someone else's gratification or domination. While Christopher was being tortured, Channon was somewhere else in the house, likely aware of what was happening to him, likely hearing his screams, likely experiencing her own assaults, likely trapped in a nightmare that kept getting worse when you thought it couldn't possibly get any worse. The timeline of that first night is difficult to establish with precision. The perpetrators gave different accounts during later interrogations, each trying to minimize their own involvement while implicating others. But what's clear is that both victims were held overnight Saturday into Sunday, that both were subjected to repeated assaults, that the people holding them showed no inclination to end this quickly or mercifully. Somewhere during Sunday, January 7th, and the medical examiner would later give her professional opinion on the timing based on the state of the body and the injuries, Christopher Newsom was taken from the house. He was walked or dragged to railroad tracks that ran near the property. He was forced to his knees on the cold ground beside those tracks, and then they shot him, once in the back of the head, once in the neck. The gunshots were execution style, the kind meant to kill efficiently. Christopher Newsom, who had been building furniture and planning a future just 24 hours earlier, was murdered and left beside railroad tracks like discarded trash. But the cruelty didn't end with death. After shooting Christopher, and the medical examiner would testify that, based on the evidence, he might have still been alive, might have still been breathing despite the catastrophic head wound. They set his body on fire. They poured flammable liquid on him and lit it. They watched him burn. Then they left him there and returned to the house where Channon Christian was still alive, still suffering, still hoping against hope that this nightmare would end. Sunday, January 7th, 2007, dawned cold and gray across Knoxville. Somewhere in the city, beside railroad tracks in a neglected part of town, Christopher Newsom's body lay smoldering, undiscovered yet in the early morning hours. His life had ended sometime in the dark hours before dawn, ended with gunshots and fire, ended while he was less than a mile from civilization, from help, from people who could have saved him if they'd only known he needed saving. In the house on Chipman Street, Channon Christian was entering her second day of captivity, second day of torture, second day of being subjected to assaults and degradation by multiple perpetrators, second day of experiencing pain and terror and hopelessness, while the world outside continued its normal rhythms, while families attended church services, while people went about their Sunday routines. completely unaware that a young woman was suffering unspeakable horrors just streets away from their ordinary lives. Think about what those hours must have been like for Channon. By Sunday morning, if she hadn't already known before, she would have understood that Christopher was gone. Either she'd heard the gunshots, or she'd noticed his absence, or her captors had told her in the casual cruelty that characterized everything they did. She would have known she was alone now, that there was no one coming to rescue her, that her only companion in this nightmare was gone, and she was at the mercy of people who had already demonstrated they possessed no mercy. She would have been in extraordinary pain by this point. Then the medical evidence would later catalog injuries that accumulated over time. Blunt force trauma to the head and face that left her features swollen and bruised. Injuries to her genitalia consistent with repeated sexual assault. Injuries to other parts of her body from being beaten and abused. She would have been hungry, thirsty, exhausted beyond anything she'd ever experienced. She would have been terrified in a way that makes the word terror seem inadequate, and she would have been hoping, because humans cling to hope even in the most hopeless circumstances. Even when every rational assessment says there's no way out, no possibility of survival, no chance of rescue, we hope. Maybe Channon hoped her parents would find her somehow. Maybe she hoped the police would track her down. Maybe she hoped her captors would tire of tormenting her and let her go. Maybe she just hoped for death to come quickly when it came, for the end to be merciful even if nothing else had been. While Channon suffered in that house, her family was experiencing their own particular hell. Dina Christian had spent Saturday night growing increasingly worried as the hours passed with no word from Channon. By Sunday morning, when her daughter still hadn't come home, hadn't called, hadn't responded to messages, Dina's maternal instinct was screaming that something was catastrophically wrong. Channon wasn't the type to stay out all night without letting her parents know where she was. She was responsible, considerate, the kind of daughter who understood that her parents worried, and who took steps to ease that worry. Her phone going straight to voicemail wasn't normal. Her complete silence wasn't normal. Everything about this situation felt wrong in a way that made Dina's stomach clench with dread. Gary Christian felt the same growing panic about his daughter. He started making calls Sunday morning to Channon's friends, to the friend whose apartment she'd been planning to visit, to anyone who might know where she was or when they'd last seen her. The responses he got only deepened his fear. No one had seen Channon. She and Christopher had never arrived at the friend's apartment Saturday night. The friend had assumed they'd changed their plans, had thought nothing of it until Gary called asking if they'd shown up. Mary and Hugh Newsom were experiencing identical panic about Christopher. Their son hadn't come home Saturday night. He wasn't answering his phone. He hadn't contacted anyone. This wasn't like him. Christopher was reliable, the kind of young man who let his parents know if he'd be late, who understood that silence caused worry. His absence felt wrong. His phone going unanswered felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. The two families didn't know each other well yet. Their children's relationship was still relatively new, still in that phase where the families were just beginning to be introduced. But by Sunday afternoon, as both sets of parents made increasingly frantic calls trying to locate their missing children, they connected with each other. Channon and Christopher had been together Saturday night. Both were now missing. This couldn't be coincidence. Something terrible had happened to both of them. By late Sunday afternoon, both families had filed missing persons reports with the Knoxville Police Department. They provided photographs of their children, pictures that showed young people smiling, alive, full of the vitality that makes the idea of their deaths seem impossible. They described what Channon and Christopher had been wearing, what vehicle Channon had been driving, where they'd been planning to go, everything that might help locate them. The police took the reports with professional courtesy and appropriate concern, but they also approached the situation with the statistical knowledge that most missing adults turn up within 24 to 48 hours. Young couples sometimes fight and need space. Sometimes they take spontaneous trips without telling their families. Sometimes they are avoiding home for personal reasons. The officers who took the reports were concerned, but not yet alarmed. They documented everything, filed the reports, began the preliminary work of trying to locate 2 missing young adults. The families, however, were far beyond concerned. They were terrified. Gary Christian would later describe that Sunday night as the beginning of a week that changed him fundamentally, that took the man he'd been and created someone different, someone who understood on a visceral level that the worst things you can imagine actually happen to real people, that there's no protective barrier between your family and catastrophic tragedy. Hugh Newsom spent Sunday evening unable to eat, unable to sit still, unable to do anything except pace and make calls and try to will his son to contact him, to walk through the door, to make this terror end with a reasonable explanation. Mary Newsom prayed in a way she'd never prayed before. Desperate prayers for her son's safety, for his return, for this to be a misunderstanding that would resolve with relief and grateful tears. What none of them knew yet was that Christopher was already dead, that his body was lying beside railroad tracks, less than 5 miles from where his parents sat, desperately waiting for word of him. That while they prayed for his safety, he was already beyond safety, beyond help, beyond anything except the justice that would or wouldn't come later. What none of them knew was that Channon was still alive but enduring a second day of torture in a house that had become a chamber of horrors. That while her mother cried and her father made phone calls, Channon was being assaulted by multiple men, was being beaten and violated and degraded, was experiencing suffering that no human being should have to experience. Inside that house on Chipman Street, the 5 perpetrators were fully aware that what they were doing would result in the most serious criminal charges imaginable. They knew they were committing capital crimes, the kind that could result in death sentences. They knew the victims could identify them, could testify against them, could send them to prison forever if allowed to survive. And yet they continued. They didn't kill the victims quickly to eliminate witnesses. They prolonged the suffering. They took their time. They seemed to derive pleasure or satisfaction from the torture itself, from the exercise of complete power over helpless people. Vanessa Coleman, the only woman in the group, moved through that house, knowing what was happening to Channon Christian. She knew a woman her own age was being gang raped in that house. She knew Channon was being beaten and tortured, and she did nothing to help. She didn't sneak a phone call to police. She didn't try to free Channon or ease her suffering. Instead, Coleman focused on the material benefits of the crimes. She took Channon's credit cards and went shopping. She tried on Channon's clothes. She wore Channon's jewelry. She treated the items stolen from a woman being tortured as spoils to enjoy. Think about the psychology required for that kind of behavior. Think about what it means to be in a house where another woman your own age is screaming in pain and terror, and your response is to go through her purse and use her credit cards to buy things for yourself. And the absence of empathy, of basic human solidarity, of any recognition of shared humanity between women, it's almost more chilling than the direct violence the men committed. Monday, January 8th brought a discovery that would begin to connect the dots between a missing couple and a horrific crime scene, though it would take time for investigators to piece together the full picture. Early that morning, someone passing by the railroad tracks near Chipman Street noticed something that didn't belong there. What appeared to be a body partially burned, lying beside the tracks. The Knoxville police were called. Officers and crime scene investigators responded to find Christopher Newsom's remains. The scene told a story of extreme violence, gunshot wounds visible despite the fire damage, evidence of the victim having been positioned execution style before being shot, signs that accelerant had been used to burn the body. This was clearly a homicide, and a particularly brutal one. The body was badly burned, which complicated immediate identification. The fire had done significant damage to facial features and other characteristics that might allow visual identification. The investigators would need to use other methods: dental records, fingerprints, if they could recover usable prints, DNA analysis. They photographed the scene meticulously, collected evidence, began the painstaking work of documenting every detail that might eventually lead them to whoever had committed this murder. The medical examiner's office took possession of the body. Dr. Darinka Mileusnik-Polchan, the Knox County Chief Medical Examiner, would perform the autopsy. What she discovered would prove crucial to understanding what Christopher had endured before his death. The gunshot wounds were obvious: one to the back of the head, one to the neck, either potentially fatal. But the external examination also revealed injuries consistent with assault. And the internal examination would reveal evidence of sexual assault, anal rape that had occurred before death. Dr. Mileusnik-Polchan also examined the burn patterns on the body and the evidence from the scene to form an opinion about whether Christopher had been alive when set on fire. Based on the lack of soot in the airways and other indicators, she believed the gunshot wounds had likely been fatal or immediately incapacitating before the fire was set. This was perhaps the only mercy in Christopher's death, that he probably didn't experience the burning, that his suffering had ended with the bullets. While the medical examiner was conducting her autopsy Monday morning, trying to identify the victim and understand what had been done to him, the Newsom family was experiencing another day of agonizing uncertainty. They'd spent a sleepless night waiting for word of Christopher, hoping his disappearance would resolve with a reasonable explanation. Monday brought no such resolution, only continued silence from their son, continued inability to reach him, continued terror about what might have happened. The Christian family was in the same desperate situation regarding Channon. Dina Christian spent Monday organizing search efforts, making flyers with Channon's photograph, contacting local media to ask them to publicize the disappearance, coordinating with police to understand what was being done to find her daughter. She operated on determination and fear, pushing through exhaustion and panic to do everything possible to bring Channon home. Gary Christian worked with law enforcement, providing them with any information that might help. Channon's phone records, her social media accounts, names of friends and acquaintances, her schedule and habits and routines. he pushed investigators to devote more resources to the case, to treat this with the urgency he felt it deserved. His daughter was missing. Every hour that passed might be an hour closer to finding her alive, or an hour too late to save her. By Monday afternoon, the Knoxville Police Department had successfully identified the body found by the railroad tracks as Christopher Newsom. They used dental records to make the confirmation. Now they had to do the terrible work of notifying his family. When police arrived at the Newsom home Monday evening to deliver the news, Mary Newsom knew before they spoke. She saw it in their faces, in the way they carried themselves, in the careful compassion of their expressions. Her son was dead. The detectives confirmed it as gently as they could. Christopher had been found. He'd been murdered. They were investigating. They were so very sorry. The sound that came from Mary Newsom was primordial, the howl of a mother learning her child is dead, a sound that comes from somewhere deeper than thought or language, a sound of grief so profound it seems impossible one human body could contain it. Hugh Newsom felt his legs give out, felt the world tilt and spin, felt the future he'd imagined for his son evaporate like morning mist. Their boy was gone, not missing anymore, not lost, dead, murdered, shot and burned and discarded beside railroad tracks. The grief was immediate and overwhelming, but mixed with that grief was terrible fear. Because if Christopher was dead, where was Channon? The two had been together Saturday night. They'd clearly been victims of the same crime. If Christopher had been murdered, was Channon already dead too? Or was she still alive somewhere, still in danger, still suffering? The Knoxville police now had a murder investigation that was clearly connected to an active missing persons case. And they focused increased resources on finding Channon Christian, on tracking the movements of both victims before Christopher's death, on piecing together what had happened Saturday night. Detectives worked around the clock, driven by the possibility that every hour mattered, that Channon might still be alive and might still be saved if they could just find her in time. One crucial piece of evidence led investigators in the right direction. Channon's Toyota 4Runner was found abandoned in the parking lot at Washington Ridge Apartments, the very place the couple had been heading Saturday night. The vehicle was immediately impounded and processed for forensic evidence. Crime scene technicians went over it meticulously, using various lights and chemicals to find and collect fingerprints, DNA, any trace evidence that might identify who had been in the vehicle besides Channon and Christopher. What they found told a story. There were signs of a struggle. There were items belonging to both victims. There was biological evidence, hair, skin cells, other materials that would eventually be analyzed and matched to suspects. Most importantly, there were fingerprints that didn't belong to Channon or Christopher. When run through databases, some of those prints would eventually match known criminals with records in the system. The forensic analysis took time. DNA processing in 2007 wasn't as fast as it would later become. But investigators had other leads to pursue while waiting for lab results. Witnesses near Washington Ridge Apartments were interviewed. Had anyone seen anything Saturday night? Had anyone noticed Channon's 4Runner being driven after the couple would have arrived? Had anyone seen suspicious activity or unfamiliar people in the area? Some witnesses provided useful information. They'd seen the 4Runner being driven in the area after Saturday night. They'd seen it near Chipman Street, in the vicinity of the railroad tracks, where Christopher's body was found. This information helped investigators focus their attention on a specific geographic area, the neighborhood around Chipman Street, less than a mile from Washington Ridge Apartments. Detectives began looking at known criminals who lived in or frequented that area. They pulled records for recent parolees, for people with histories of carjacking or robbery or violence. They interviewed informants and people on the street who might have heard something. Slowly, names began to emerge. Lamarcus Davidson's name came up, his brother Latalvis Cobbins, George Thomas. These were people with criminal histories who were known to associate with each other, who were known to be in the Chipman Street area. While investigators pursued these leads Monday into Tuesday, Channon Christian was enduring her third day of captivity in the house at 2316 Chipman Street. 3 days of torture, 3 days of repeated sexual assault, 3 days of beatings and degradation, 3 days of experiencing pain that should have killed her but didn't, that just continued and continued until her body and mind were pushed far beyond what anyone should have to endure. The medical evidence would later indicate that Channon fought back when she could. She had defensive wounds, injuries to her hands and arms, consistent with trying to protect herself, trying to fend off attacks. She didn't submit passively to what was being done to her, despite being bound at times, despite being outnumbered and overpowered, despite knowing that resistance might make the torture worse. She fought. She resisted. She tried to survive. But by Tuesday, she would have been critically injured. The accumulated trauma to her body from multiple sexual assaults, from repeated beatings, from 3 days without adequate food or water or medical care, it would have been catastrophic. She would have been in shock. She might have been fading in and out of consciousness. Her captors knew she was dying. They could see it. And their response was not mercy or medical help or even a quick end to her suffering. Their response was to make her final hours even worse. Tuesday, January 9th, was likely Channon Christian's last day alive. The exact timeline would be difficult to establish with precision. The medical examiner would give her professional opinion based on the state of the body when it was discovered and the progression of injuries. But there's always some uncertainty. What we know with certainty is that Channon died slowly, that she suffered until the very end, that her killers showed her no mercy, even when it must have been obvious she was dying. At some point on Tuesday, perhaps in the afternoon or evening, someone in that house forced Channon to drink or otherwise ingest cleaning chemicals. The medical evidence would later show chemical burns in her mouth, throat, and esophagus, consistent with bleach or similar caustic substances. And the purpose of this was likely twofold: to torture her further and to destroy potential DNA evidence of the sexual assaults. The perpetrators were thinking about forensics, about covering their tracks, about eliminating evidence that could link them to the rapes. Imagine being forced to swallow bleach. Imagine the burning pain as it destroys the tissue in your mouth and throat. Imagine being so weak from 3 days of torture that you can't even resist effectively. Imagine knowing this might be what finally kills you and not even having the strength to fight back. After forcing Channon to ingest the chemicals, her captors wrapped her in garbage bags. They stuffed her body into a large plastic garbage can in the kitchen of the house. And then, and this is perhaps the most horrific detail in a case full of horrors, they left her there while she was still alive. Dr. Miliusnik-Polchin, the medical examiner who would later perform Channon's autopsy, would testify about this with clinical precision. Based on the evidence, based on the injuries and the blood patterns and the position of the body, based on all her experience and expertise, she concluded that Channon Christian was still breathing when placed in that garbage can, that she died slowly of asphyxiation, that she suffocated over a period of time while trapped in darkness, unable to move, unable to escape, unable to do anything except experience her own death. Think about Channon's last moments. 21 years old, a college student with dreams of helping people, with a family who loved her desperately, with a whole life that should have unfolded over decades. Instead, she died in a garbage can, suffocating slowly, her last conscious thoughts probably of her parents, of Christopher, of how wrong it was that her life was ending this way. She probably called out for help, even though she knew no help was coming. She probably fought against the suffocation, even though there was no way to win that fight. She probably experienced every second of her death with terrible clarity. And when her breathing finally stopped, when Channon Christian's heart beat its last beat, and her brain ceased its activity, and she was finally beyond pain, the people who had killed her simply left her body in that garbage can and went about their business. They didn't try to hide the body somewhere else. They didn't dispose of it. They just left it in the kitchen and continued using the house, walking past that garbage can, probably smelling the decomposition as it began and not caring. While Channon was dying alone in that garbage can on Tuesday, while her suffering was finally ending after 3 days of unimaginable torture, her mother was on television begging for information about her daughter's whereabouts. Local news stations had picked up the story of the missing couple by this point, particularly after Christopher's body had been found Monday. Dina Christian appeared on camera with Channon's photograph, with tears streaming down her face, begging anyone who knew anything to come forward. "Please," Dina said to the cameras, to anyone watching, to her daughter, if somehow Channon could hear her, "Please help us find her. Please let her come home. If someone has her, please let her go. She's a good person. She doesn't deserve this. Please." But Channon couldn't hear her mother's pleas. By the time those news broadcasts aired Tuesday evening, Channon was likely already dead or dying, was beyond hearing, beyond help, beyond anything except the cold forensic examination that would document what had been done to her. Wednesday, January 10th, brought the investigation to 2316 Chipman Street. Detectives had developed enough information from the forensic evidence in Channon's vehicle, from witness statements, from surveillance footage showing the vehicle in that area, from the criminal histories of suspects connected to that location, to obtain a search warrant for the house. When officers approached the small rental house that Wednesday morning, they had no idea whether they'd find Channon Christian alive or dead. They hoped for alive, prepared themselves for dead, and tried to stay focused on the job of processing whatever they found. The smell hit them before they even entered. That unmistakable odor of decomposition, of death, of human tissue breaking down. Any officer with experience recognizes that smell immediately. Someone was dead in that house. The question was who? They executed the warrant, made entry into the filthy interior of 2316 Chipman Street, and began to search. The house was cluttered and disgusting, trash everywhere, evidence of drug use, stolen property, the accumulated debris of criminal lives, lived without any pretense of normalcy. In the bedroom, they found items belonging to both Channon and Christopher, and they found evidence of the crimes that had occurred there. And in the kitchen, they found a large plastic garbage can. Inside that garbage can were black plastic garbage bags. Inside those garbage bags was Channon Christian's body. The officers who found her were experienced professionals, people who had seen death in various forms throughout their careers. But this broke them. Several stepped outside to compose themselves. Some wept. The sheer brutality of what had been done to this young woman, the callousness of stuffing her body in the trash like she was garbage, the evidence visible even before the medical examination of torture sustained over days. It was too much for human hearts to process without breaking a little. The crime scene was meticulously documented. Photographs were taken of everything. Evidence was collected with painstaking care. Every item in that house that might be relevant to the case was bagged and tagged and sent for analysis. The garbage can containing Channon's body was photographed in place before the body was removed and sent to the medical examiner's office. Dina Christian received the call Wednesday afternoon. The police needed her to help with identification, to confirm that certain items of clothing belonged to her daughter. They tried to prepare her, they tried to be gentle, but how do you tell a mother that her daughter has been found dead, that she was tortured for days, that she suffered in ways that will haunt everyone who learns the details? The detective who made the call spoke carefully, compassionately, but there was no way to soften this news. Channon had been found. She had not survived. She appeared to have been held for several days before her death. The investigation was now a homicide investigation. They were so very sorry. Dina's reaction was visceral. That same primal scream of grief that Mary Newsom had uttered just 2 days earlier. That sound that comes from the deepest part of the soul when a parent learns their child is dead. But for Dina, there was also rage. Pure, righteous, burning rage at what had been done to her daughter. That rage would sustain her through the years to come, would fuel her determination to see justice done, to make sure Channon's killers faced full accountability, to ensure her daughter's death meant something. Gary Christian felt the same fury. His daughter had been taken from him, tortured, murdered, and discarded in a garbage can. Someone would pay for that. Multiple someones. He would make sure of it. He would attend every hearing, every trial, every legal proceeding. He would look Channon's killers in the eyes and make sure they saw the father whose daughter they had destroyed. The Newsom family, still reeling from the loss of Christopher just days earlier, now learned the full extent of what Channon had endured. The two families connected in their shared grief, their shared rage, their shared determination that the people responsible would face the harshest possible consequences. They became united in their mission for justice, bound together by tragedy in a way no families should have to be bound. By Wednesday evening, January 10th, 2007, both victims had been found. Both families had been notified. The community knew that something terrible had happened in their midst, and the hunt for the perpetrators, which had been building momentum, now intensified into the full-scale manhunt that would result in arrests within days. But before we get to the arrests and the trials and the long legal battle that followed, I want you to pause here and think about something. Leave a comment below. Tell me honestly, do you believe the media treats all victims equally? Do you think Channon and Christopher's story would have received different coverage if the racial dynamics had been reversed? Because here's what happened in the days after the bodies were found. The local media covered it extensively, but the national media remained largely silent. This was January 2007. The cable news networks were well established in their pattern of coverage for missing and murdered young people. They devoted countless hours to Natalie Holloway, who had disappeared in Aruba in 2005. They'd turned Lacey Peterson's murder into a national obsession. They regularly covered cases of missing white women with the kind of saturation coverage that made the victims' names household knowledge. Channon Christian was a white college student. Christopher Newsom was a white working man. Both were photogenic, both sympathetic, both completely innocent victims of horrific crimes. The case had every element that typically drew national media attention. And yet, beyond local coverage in Tennessee, the story was largely ignored by CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and other major outlets. Why? What do you think? Does the fact that the perpetrators were black make this case less appealing to national media? Does it make it more complicated, more politically sensitive, less safe to cover? Or am I wrong? Maybe there are other reasons for the lack of coverage that have nothing to do with race. Tell me what you think in the comments. I really want to know your honest opinion on this. The arrests came swiftly once Channon's body was discovered. The Knoxville Police Department, now investigating a double homicide with evidence of torture, sexual assault, and extreme brutality, devoted enormous resources to identifying and apprehending everyone involved. The forensic evidence from Channon's vehicle, from the crime scene at 2316 Chipman Street, and from the victims' bodies, created a web of connections that pointed directly at specific suspects. Lamarcus Davidson was the first priority. As the ringleader, as the person in whose residence the crimes had occurred, as the individual with the most extensive criminal history and the most obvious connections to the case, he was the primary target. Detectives knew he was aware that police were looking for him. Word travels fast in criminal circles. And by Wednesday, when Channon's body was found, Davidson knew his house had been raided and evidence had been collected. He went into hiding, moving between various locations, relying on friends and associates to shelter him from law enforcement. But hiding in Knoxville when every police officer in the city is looking for you, when your photograph is being shown on every news broadcast, when there's enormous public pressure to apprehend you, is nearly impossible. It's not like the movies where fugitives can disappear for months or years. In reality, most fugitives are caught within days, especially when they're staying in the same general area where they're known. On Sunday, January 14th, exactly 1 week after Christopher's murder, 4 days after Channon's body was discovered, law enforcement received a tip about Davidson's location. He was hiding in a vacant house in a rundown neighborhood, living without electricity or running water, probably hungry and frightened and aware that his capture was inevitable. A tactical team surrounded the house. They called for Davidson to surrender. After a brief standoff, knowing he had no real options, Lamarcus Davidson emerged with his hands up and was taken into custody. The arrest was a relief to the community and to the victims' families. The ringleader was in custody. He couldn't hurt anyone else. He would face justice for what he'd done. But Davidson was only one of 5 perpetrators. The others needed to be caught as well. Letelvius Cobbins, Davidson's brother, was arrested on January 11th, the day after Channon's body was found. He'd been identified through fingerprints, found in Channon's vehicle and through witness statements placing him at the scene. When police located him, he initially tried to deny involvement, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. He was charged with multiple counts including murder, rape, and kidnapping. George Thomas was apprehended on January 12th. Like Cobbins, he tried to minimize his involvement, claiming he'd been present but hadn't personally participated in the assaults or murders. This is a common defense strategy among co-defendants. Everyone admits to being there, but claims someone else was the actual perpetrator, as if witnessing torture and doing nothing about it somehow absolves you of responsibility. The legal system in Tennessee doesn't work that way. Under felony murder rules and conspiracy laws, everyone who participates in the criminal enterprise shares responsibility for all crimes committed during that enterprise. Vanessa Coleman was arrested on January 12th as well. She was found in possession of items belonging to Channon Christian, clothing, jewelry, and receipts from purchases made with Channon's credit cards. When questioned, Coleman gave a statement that she clearly hoped would minimize her culpability while providing enough information to seem cooperative. She admitted being at the house. She admitted knowing the victims were being held there. She admitted using Channon's credit cards. But she claimed she hadn't participated in the violence, had been afraid of Davidson and the other men, had been essentially another victim in the situation. This defense strategy, portraying herself as a coerced participant rather than a willing accomplice, would form the basis of her legal defense in the trials to come. But it faced a significant problem. The evidence showed she'd had multiple opportunities to help the victims or contact police, and she'd chosen instead to go shopping with Channon's stolen credit cards while Channon was being tortured in the house where Coleman was staying. Eric Boyd was the last to be arrested, picked up on January 18th. His connection to the case was initially less clear than the others. He hadn't been at the house on Chipman Street during most of the torture and murders, but evidence suggested he'd been involved in the initial carjacking and had helped Davidson hide afterward. He was initially charged with being an accessory after the fact, though prosecutors would later bring additional charges as more evidence emerged about his role in the initial crimes. With all 5 suspects in custody by mid-January, the legal machinery began its slow grind toward justice. The suspects were formally arraigned, charged with a litany of crimes: first-degree murder, especially aggravated robbery, aggravated kidnapping, aggravated rape, and numerous other counts. The charges carried the possibility of the death penalty for the most culpable defendants. The victims' families attended every court appearance, sitting in the courtroom to bear witness, to make sure the defendants saw them, to demonstrate that Channon and Christopher had people who loved them and would fight for justice on their behalf. Dina Christian became a constant presence at the courthouse, her face a mask of determination and barely controlled rage. She stared at the defendants during hearings, making sure they couldn't avoid her gaze, making sure they knew that Channon's mother would be there every step of the way. The pre-trial proceedings stretched across months. Defense attorneys filed various motions, requests to suppress evidence, to move the trial to a different venue, to separate the defendants so they'd be tried individually rather than together. The prosecution fought these motions when appropriate and agreed to others when the law required it. Eventually, it was decided that the defendants would be tried separately, which meant the families would have to endure multiple trials, hearing the evidence repeated, reliving the details of their children's deaths again and again. The community response to the arrests and charges was intense. Knoxville was a city grappling with the knowledge that something this evil had occurred in their midst, that 5 people had been capable of such brutality, that 2 innocent young people had been destroyed for no reason beyond the perpetrator's cruelty. Vigils were held. Memorial services honored Channon and Christopher. The university grieved for Channon, holding services where friends and professors spoke about the young woman they'd known, the student who had shown such promise, the life that had been stolen. But alongside the local grief and outrage, a different narrative was developing on the national stage, or rather, the lack of national coverage was itself becoming a story. Conservative media outlets and bloggers began asking why CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC weren't covering the Christian Newsom murders the way they'd covered other crimes against young white victims. The answer seemed obvious to many observers. The racial dynamics made this case uncomfortable for national media. This was 2007, during an era when discussions about race in America were becoming increasingly polarized. The idea that white victims of black perpetrators might be ignored, while black victims of white perpetrators received extensive coverage, fit into broader narratives about media bias and political correctness. Conservative commentators seized on the Christian Newsom case as an example of liberal media deliberately suppressing stories that didn't fit their preferred narratives. The victims' families found themselves in an impossible position. They wanted media attention because it helps ensure thorough investigation and prosecution, because public pressure matters in high-profile cases. But they didn't want their children's deaths weaponized for political purposes. They didn't want to become symbols in culture war debates. They wanted justice, not controversy. Dina Christian was particularly vocal about this tension. She agreed that the media coverage disparity was real and troubling. She believed all victims deserved equal attention regardless of race. But she also insisted that the Christian Newsom case wasn't about race. It was about evil. She didn't want people focusing on the perpetrator's race rather than their crimes. She didn't want hatred or division or racial animosity to become part of her daughter's legacy. "My daughter was murdered by evil people," Dina told reporters, who asked about the racial dynamics. "I don't care what color they were. I care that they're held accountable. I care that justice is done. I care that no other family has to go through what we're going through. That's what matters." But Dina also acknowledged the uncomfortable truth that if the racial dynamics had been reversed, if 5 white people had kidnapped, tortured, raped, and murdered 2 young black people, the case would have been national news immediately. It would have dominated cable coverage. There would have been discussions about hate crimes, about racial violence, about the state of race relations in America. The victims would have become national symbols. Their names would have been spoken alongside Emmett Till and other victims of racial violence. The fact that this didn't happen when the victims were white and the perpetrators were black suggested a double standard in how crimes are covered and which victims are deemed worthy of national attention. This was a truth that made many people uncomfortable, that complicated, simple narratives about media bias that required acknowledging that maybe our society doesn't treat all victims equally, regardless of what our stated values might be. As 2007 progressed and the cases moved toward trial, this question of media coverage and racial dynamics continued to percolate in the background. Some media outlets did eventually cover the story, often framing it explicitly as an example of coverage disparity. This created its own problems. The victims' deaths were being used to make political points rather than being mourned on their own terms. The families tried to keep the focus on justice. They cooperated with investigators, prepared themselves for testimony, steeled themselves for the trials that would force them to hear every detail of what their children had endured. They established scholarship funds in Channon's and Christopher's names. They spoke at victims' rights events. They did everything they could to honor their children's memories while also demanding accountability for their deaths. By late 2007, the prosecution was ready to begin taking the cases to trial. The evidence had been meticulously analyzed. Witnesses had been interviewed and re-interviewed. The medical examiner's findings had been documented in painful detail. Defense attorneys had conducted their own investigations and prepared their strategies. The legal battle that would consume the next several years was about to begin. The first trial began in the summer of 2009, more than 2 years after the murders. 2 years of waiting, of grief barely held in check, of watching the defendants receive medical care and legal representation while Channon and Christopher lay in graves. 2 years of preparing themselves emotionally for what they knew would be an ordeal, sitting in a courtroom, hearing the evidence, seeing photographs of what had been done to their children, watching defense attorneys try to create doubt or minimize their client's culpability. Lamarcus Davidson was tried first. As the ringleader, as the person in whose house the crimes occurred, as the most culpable defendant based on the evidence, he faced the most serious charges and the most likely path to a death sentence. Judge Richard Baumgartner presided over the trial. The prosecution was led by experienced prosecutors who understood the gravity of the case and the need for meticulous presentation of evidence. The trial began with jury selection, a process that took days, given the extensive pretrial publicity and the death penalty implications. Potential jurors were questioned extensively about their ability to be fair, their views on the death penalty, their exposure to media coverage of the case. Eventually, a jury of 12 was seated, along with alternates. These were the citizens who would decide Davidson's fate, who would hear the evidence and determine guilt or innocence, who would potentially decide whether he lived or died for what he'd done. The prosecution's opening statement laid out the timeline of horror. They told the jury about 2 young people going to watch a movie, about a carjacking that became a kidnapping, about 4 days of torture and sexual assault, about murders committed with shocking brutality. They promised to prove beyond any reasonable doubt that Lamarcus Davidson was responsible for these crimes, that the evidence would show his guilt clearly and convincingly. The defense's opening statement tried to create doubt about Davidson's personal responsibility for the murders. They acknowledged he'd been present, that crimes had occurred in his house, but suggested that others had been the actual killers, that Davidson's culpability was less than the prosecution claimed. This strategy, admitting presence but denying direct participation, is common in cases with multiple defendants, though it faces the significant obstacle of felony murder rules that make all participants equally responsible. The prosecution then began presenting their evidence, and this is where the trial became almost unbearable for the victims' families. The first witnesses were law enforcement officers who had responded to the discovery of Christopher's body by the railroad tracks, and later to the search of the house on Chipman Street. They testified about what they'd found, about the condition of the crime scenes, about the evidence collected. Crime scene photographs were shown to the jury, photographs that showed Christopher's burned body, that showed the garbage can where Channon had been found, that showed the filthy interior of the house where the torture had occurred. Dina Christian sat in the courtroom and saw photographs of her daughter's body stuffed in a garbage can. Gary Christian sat beside his wife and held her hand and felt rage so intense it was physically painful. Mary and Hugh Newsom saw photographs of their son's body beside railroad tracks, burned and discarded. This was the price of justice, having to see, having to know, having to bear witness to exactly what had been done to the people they loved most in the world. The forensic evidence was presented next. DNA experts testified about biological materials found at the crime scenes and on the victims' bodies. And the DNA evidence conclusively linked Davidson and the other defendants to the victims and the crimes. There were DNA matches from semen found on and in Channon's body, evidence of the sexual assaults. There were DNA matches from materials found in the house. The scientific evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. Then came the testimony that broke even the most composed observers. Dr. Darinka Mileosnik-Polchin, the chief medical examiner, took the stand to describe her autopsy findings. She testified about Christopher Newsom's injuries in clinical precise language, the gunshot wounds to the head and neck, the evidence of anal rape, the burn patterns on the body, the trauma that preceded death. She explained to the jury what Christopher had endured: being bound and gagged, being beaten, being sexually assaulted, being walked to railroad tracks and forced to his knees, being shot execution style. She offered her professional opinion about whether he'd been alive when set on fire, explaining the indicators she'd looked for in the autopsy and her conclusion that the gunshots had likely been immediately fatal or incapacitating. Then Dr. Mileosnik-Polchin testified about Channon Christian's autopsy, and this testimony was so difficult that even the judge had to pause the proceedings at points to allow people to compose themselves. She described injuries consistent with repeated sexual assault over multiple days. She described blunt force trauma to the head and face. She described chemical burns in the mouth and throat from ingested cleaning products. She described numerous other injuries that painted a picture of sustained torture. The medical examiner explained that based on the evidence, Channon had been alive for days after her abduction, that she had endured repeated assaults, that toward the end of her life, she had been forced to ingest bleach or similar chemicals, that she had been wrapped in garbage bags and stuffed into a garbage can. And then Dr. Mileosnik-Polchin testified about the most horrific finding of all. Based on the evidence, she said in careful professional language, based on the presence of fluid in the lungs, based on the injuries and their progression, based on my examination of the body and the scene where it was found, it is my professional opinion that Ms. Christian was still breathing when she was placed in the garbage can. The cause of death was asphyxiation. She suffocated slowly over a period of time. The courtroom was silent except for quiet weeping. Dina Christian's face was a mask of anguish and rage. The jury members looked stricken. Several were crying. The horror of what they were hearing, that a 21-year-old woman had been stuffed in a garbage can while still alive and left to suffocate slowly, was almost too much to process. The defense tried to cross-examine Dr. Mileusnik Polchin, tried to create doubt about her conclusions, tried to suggest that perhaps death had come more quickly than she believed. But the medical examiner stood firm in her professional opinion. The evidence supported her conclusions. Channon Christian had died slowly, had suffered until the very end, had experienced her own death with terrible awareness. After the medical examiner's testimony, the prosecution called witnesses who could place Davidson at the scene and connect him to the crimes. Former associates testified about statements Davidson had made. People who had been at or near the house testified about what they'd seen and heard. Some of these witnesses had credibility problems. They were criminals themselves, people with their own legal troubles who might be testifying to get favorable treatment. But their testimony was corroborated by the physical evidence, by the DNA, by the forensics that couldn't be impeached or dismissed. The prosecution also presented evidence of Davidson's consciousness of guilt, his flight after the crimes, his attempts to hide his statements to others that demonstrated his awareness of what he'd done. They showed the jury that Davidson knew these were capital crimes, knew he was facing the death penalty if caught, knew that what he'd done was so monstrous that society's ultimate punishment might be imposed. The defense presented their case, calling witnesses who tried to suggest that others had been more culpable than Davidson, that he hadn't personally committed all the acts charged against him. They tried to create doubt about the timeline, about who did what when. But the evidence was too strong. The DNA was conclusive. The medical examiner's testimony was unimpeachable. And the sheer fact that these crimes had occurred in Davidson's house, under his control, made him legally responsible even for acts committed by others. The jury deliberated for several hours before returning with their verdict: guilty on all counts. First-degree murder of Christopher Newsom. First-degree murder of Channon Christian, especially aggravated kidnapping, aggravated rape, especially aggravated robbery, all the charges that carried the possibility of death. The families felt relief wash over them. Justice was being done. The man most responsible for their children's deaths had been found guilty. But the trial wasn't over. Now came the penalty phase, where the same jury would decide whether Lamarcus Davidson should be sentenced to death or to life in prison. The penalty phase of Davidson's trial forced the families to endure yet another ordeal. In Tennessee, as in other death penalty states, the jury that convicts a defendant of a capital crime must then hear additional evidence and decide whether aggravating factors outweigh mitigating factors sufficiently to warrant a death sentence. And the prosecution presents evidence of aggravating circumstances, factors that make the crime particularly heinous and the defendant particularly deserving of the ultimate punishment. The defense presents mitigating evidence, factors about the defendant's background, mental health, or character that might argue for mercy. The aggravating factors in Davidson's case were numerous and overwhelming. Multiple victims, murders committed during the commission of other violent felonies, heinous, atrocious, and cruel manner of killing, the torture and prolonged suffering inflicted on the victims before death. The prosecution didn't have to work hard to establish that this case warranted the death penalty, if any case ever did. The defense presented mitigating evidence about Davidson's troubled childhood, and they brought in family members to testify about abuse he'd suffered as a child, about his exposure to violence and drugs at a young age, about his lack of positive role models. They presented evidence of his drug addiction, suggesting that his judgment had been impaired during the crimes. They brought in mental health experts to testify about his psychological issues, about personality disorders or cognitive deficits that might have contributed to his criminal behavior. This created one of the painful ironies inherent in death penalty cases. The defendant receives the kind of humanizing attention in mitigation that he explicitly denied his victims. Davidson's family could plead for his life, could talk about his difficult childhood, could ask the jury to see him as a full human being, worthy of mercy. Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom were denied that same consideration when they begged for their lives. The prosecution reminded the jury of this in their closing argument during the penalty phase. The defense has asked you to consider Lamarcus Davidson's humanity, the prosecutor said. They've asked you to consider his difficult childhood, his struggles, his potential for redemption. But where was Davidson's consideration of Channon Christian's humanity when she was being tortured in his house for 4 days? Where was his consideration of Christopher Newsom's humanity when he was forced to his knees and shot in the head? These victims begged for mercy. They begged for their lives. And Lamarcus Davidson showed them none. He deserves none in return. The jury deliberated on the sentence for hours, taking their responsibility seriously, weighing the evidence, considering the magnitude of deciding whether another human being should live or die. Finally, they returned with their decision: death. Lamarcus Davidson was sentenced to die for the murders of Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom. The families felt a measure of satisfaction, though satisfaction is perhaps the wrong word for the emotion you feel when someone is sentenced to death for murdering your child. Relief, maybe. A sense that justice had been served, that society had recognized the magnitude of these crimes and responded with its most serious punishment. But also, awareness that the execution itself was years, if not decades away, that Davidson would appeal, that this wasn't truly over. And the trials of the other defendants followed similar patterns over the next months and into 2010. Letelvis Cobbins was tried and convicted, receiving a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The evidence against him was similar to that against Davidson: DNA evidence, witness testimony, his own statements that placed him at the scene and implicated him in the crimes. His defense tried the same strategy of admitting presence, but minimizing culpability, and it failed just as it had failed for Davidson. George Thomas was convicted and received life without parole as well. His trial revealed the same horrific evidence, forced the families to hear the details again, to see the photographs again, to relive the worst moments of their lives in service of justice. Eric Boyd's initial trial was different because the evidence of his direct involvement in the murders was less clear than for the others. He was convicted of being an accessory after the fact to carjacking, essentially of helping Davidson hide and evading police, and sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. But prosecutors made clear they were continuing to investigate his role in the initial carjacking and murders, and additional charges might be forthcoming. Vanessa Coleman's trial in 2010 drew particular attention because she was the only woman among the defendants, and because her role was qualitatively different from the men's. She hadn't participated in the sexual assaults or the actual killings, but she had been present in the house while Channon was being tortured. She had used Channon's credit cards to go shopping. She had worn Channon's clothes. She had done absolutely nothing to help a woman her own age who was screaming in pain and terror in the same house where Coleman was sleeping. The prosecution argued that Coleman's presence, her failure to help, her active participation in using the stolen property, and her knowledge of what was happening made her culpable for the murders under Tennessee's felony murder rule. If someone dies during the commission of felonies you're participating in, you can be charged with murder even if you didn't personally kill anyone. Coleman's defense portrayed her as essentially another victim, as a young woman under Davidson's influence and control, afraid to speak up or help because she feared for her own safety. They argued she was coerced, that she was less culpable than the men, that she deserved mercy based on her age and limited role. The jury convicted Coleman of facilitating the murders and other charges, but they gave her a sentence that shocked and outraged the victims' families. She received 53 years in prison, but with credit for time served in Tennessee's sentencing guidelines, she would be eligible for parole after serving about 30 years. This meant she could potentially be released while still in her 50s, could potentially have a life after prison, could potentially experience freedom again. Channon Christian would never be in her 50s. She would never experience freedom again because she died at 21, tortured for days, suffocated in a garbage can. And the woman who was present during that torture, who heard Channon's screams, who did nothing to help and actually benefited from the crimes by using Channon's property, might someday walk free. The disparity felt like a profound injustice. Dina Christian was particularly vocal about Coleman's sentence. How can someone who was in that house, who heard my daughter suffering, who did absolutely nothing to help her, get a sentence that includes the possibility of parole? She asked reporters. How is that justice? How does that reflect the severity of what happened to Channon? But the sentence stood. Coleman was sent to prison with the possibility of eventual release, and the families had to accept this outcome, had to add it to the long list of things about this case that felt wrong, that felt like insufficient justice for what their children had endured. By early 2010, all 5 defendants had been tried and convicted. All were in prison. Most would never be released. Lamarcus Davidson was on death row. The others faced life sentences or decades behind bars. The families could finally begin to move forward, to grieve without the constant weight of pending trials, to try to rebuild lives that had been shattered 3 years earlier. But then something happened that would drag them back into the nightmare, that would threaten everything they'd fought for, that would require them to find strength they didn't know they still possessed. In 2011, a scandal erupted that threatened to undo all the convictions. Judge Richard Baumgartner, who had presided over the trials of Davidson, Cobbins, and Thomas, was revealed to have been using drugs throughout the proceedings. Specifically, he'd been abusing prescription pills, purchasing them illegally from a defendant in another case, and potentially impaired during court sessions. The revelation came to light through an investigation into Baumgartner's conduct. Once it became public, the legal implications were immediately apparent. Defense attorneys would argue that their clients hadn't received fair trials, that the judge's drug use and impairment violated their constitutional rights to due process, that the convictions should be overturned and new trials granted. For the victims' families, this felt like being punched in the gut repeatedly. After everything they had endured, sitting through trials, hearing the horrific details of their children's deaths, seeing justice done and the killers convicted. Now there was a possibility it would all be undone, that they'd have to go through it all again, that procedural issues completely unrelated to the defendant's obvious guilt might result in new trials or even the possibility of reduced sentences or acquittals on technicalities. The legal system had to grapple with a terrible question. How do you balance the rights of defendants to a fair trial with the interests of justice and the well-being of victims' families? Judge Baumgartner had been wrong to use drugs. His conduct had been deeply unethical and potentially criminal. But did that mean that 3 clearly guilty men convicted on overwhelming evidence that had been presented competently by prosecutors and examined by defense attorneys should get new trials? Defense attorneys filed motions for new trials, arguing that Baumgartner's impairment created an appearance of impropriety so great that the convictions couldn't stand. They argued that even if the evidence had been overwhelming, even if the jury had reached the correct verdict, the process had been tainted by having an impaired judge presiding. The prosecution fought to keep the convictions intact. They argued that Baumgartner's drug use, while wrong, hadn't actually affected the fairness of the trials. They pointed out that the evidence against the defendants had been so overwhelming that no judge, impaired or not, could have changed the outcomes. They argued that the jury had heard all the evidence, the defense attorneys had been able to cross-examine witnesses and present their cases, that procedural fairness had been maintained despite the judge's personal issues. But the Tennessee Court of Criminal Appeals ultimately decided that the convictions couldn't stand as they were. The appearance of impropriety was too great. The possibility that Baumgartner's impairment had affected his rulings, his demeanor, his ability to ensure fair trials was too significant to ignore. In the interest of protecting defendants' constitutional rights, even at enormous cost to the victims' families, new trials were ordered for Davidson, Cobbins, and Thomas. When Dina Christian learned of this decision, she experienced a level of despair she hadn't felt since the day she learned Channon was dead. She'd have to sit through another trial. She'd have to hear Dr. Mileos Nick Polchin describe Channon's injuries again. She'd have to see the crime scene photos again. She'd have to watch defense attorneys attack her daughter's character, try to create doubt about the timeline, do whatever they could to get their clients acquitted or reduce their sentences. But Dina did something extraordinary. She didn't break. She didn't give up. She gathered herself, found reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed, and made a decision. If she had to go through this again, she would. Because the alternative, letting these killers potentially escape full justice on a technicality, was unacceptable. "I'll sit through 1,000 trials if that's what it takes," Dina told reporters. "I'll hear the details 1,000 times. I'll look at those pictures 1,000 times. I'll do whatever is necessary to make sure the people who tortured and murdered my daughter face full accountability. They don't get to walk free because a judge made mistakes. Justice for Channon matters more than my comfort." The Newsom family made the same commitment. Mary and Hugh prepared themselves to endure the retrials, to hear again about what Christopher had suffered, to see again the evidence of his final hours. They would be there. They would bear witness. They would make sure their son's killers didn't escape justice. The retrials began in 2013, 6 years after the murders. And here's where something important happened. The prosecution, knowing they had a second chance, knowing that the eyes of the nation were now on this case in a way they hadn't been before, knowing that they couldn't afford any mistakes, put together even stronger presentations than they had the first time. They were meticulous in jury selection, ensuring that every person seated could be fair and wasn't aware of the previous trial outcomes. They presented the evidence even more systematically. They called the same witnesses, the police officers, the forensic experts, the medical examiner, and let them tell the same terrible story of what had been done to Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom. The family sat through it all again. Dina Christian attended every single day of every retrial, sitting in the front row where the defendants couldn't avoid seeing her, where her presence was a constant reminder of whose daughter they had destroyed. She wore a button with Channon's photograph on it. She stared at the defendants with eyes that burned with rage and determination. Lamarcus Davidson's retrial resulted in the same verdict: guilty on all counts. And the evidence was just as overwhelming the second time. The DNA evidence was just as conclusive. The medical examiner's testimony was just as devastating. The jury deliberated and reached the same conclusion the first jury had reached. Davidson was guilty of murdering Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom with extreme brutality. The penalty phase resulted in the same sentence: death. A different jury heard the same evidence about aggravating and mitigating factors and reached the same conclusion. Lamarcus Davidson deserved to die for what he had done. This time, there could be no argument about the judge being impaired or the trial being tainted. The process had been scrupulously fair. The verdict was just. Letelvis Cobbin's retrial also resulted in guilty verdicts and a sentence of life without parole. George Thomas received the same. In each case, different juries heard the evidence and reached the same conclusions as the first juries. The retrials confirmed what everyone who had followed the case already knew. These men were guilty, the evidence against them was overwhelming, and the sentences imposed were appropriate to the magnitude of their crimes. Vanessa Coleman also received a new trial and was resentenced. This time, perhaps, recognizing that her initial sentence had been too lenient, given her role in the crimes, the judge imposed a sentence of 35 years, longer than the first sentence, though still one that included the eventual possibility of parole. By the time the retrials concluded in the mid-2010s, almost a decade had passed since the murders. The families had spent 10 years fighting for justice, enduring trials and retrials, hearing the details of their children's deaths again and again, watching the legal system work slowly through its processes. But they had prevailed. The convictions stood. The sentences stood. The killers would spend the rest of their lives behind bars. There was one more piece of legal business to resolve. Eric Boyd, who had originally been convicted only of being an accessory after the fact, was indicted on federal charges related to the carjacking and murders in 2018. Over the years since the initial trials, additional evidence and testimony had emerged that more clearly established his direct involvement in the initial carjacking and potentially in the crimes that followed. Boyd was tried in federal court in 2019, 12 years after the murders. New witnesses testified about his role. new evidence was presented. And in 2019, Eric Boyd was convicted on federal charges of carjacking, resulting in death, and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This meant that all 5 defendants were now guaranteed to spend the rest of their lives behind bars, with the exception of Coleman, who retained the distant possibility of parole, and Davidson, who awaited execution on death row. Every person who had participated in the kidnapping, torture, rape, and murder of Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom had been held accountable. The legal proceedings were finally truly over. Sitting here now, 17 years after Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom were murdered, I can tell you that their families won, not in the way anyone would choose. Not by getting their children back. That was impossible. From the moment those bullets entered Christopher's head, from the moment Channon took her last breath in that garbage can. But they won in the ways that mattered within the realm of what was possible after such catastrophic loss. They won because justice was served. Lamarcus Davidson sits on death row in Tennessee, awaiting execution for his crimes. Whether he'll actually be executed is uncertain. Tennessee's death penalty has been used rarely in recent years, and appeals can stretch for decades. But he'll never walk free. He'll die in prison either by execution or by time. Letelvis Cobbins will die in prison. George Thomas will die in prison. Eric Boyd will die in prison. Vanessa Coleman will spend decades behind bars and may never be released. And there is no scenario where these people escape accountability for what they did. They won because Channon and Christopher are remembered as they should be, not just as victims defined by how they died, but as people who lived, who loved, who mattered. Their families made sure of that. Dina Christian became a fierce advocate for victims' rights, transforming her grief into action, her rage into purpose. She worked with lawmakers to reform how the justice system treats victims' families. She pushed for equal media coverage for all victims regardless of race. She spoke at events and conferences, telling Channon's story not to traumatize people with the horror of her death, but to honor the beauty of her life. Gary Christian did the same, establishing scholarships in Channon's name, speaking to young people about awareness and safety, making sure his daughter's death contributed something positive to the world, even though her death itself was meaningless violence. Hugh and Mary Newsom honored Christopher through similar work, ensuring their son was remembered as the gentle, hard-working young man he'd been, not just as a murder victim. They won because they survived. Grief of this magnitude destroys some people. The weight of knowing exactly how your child suffered, of sitting through trials and retrials, of fighting for years just to see basic justice done. It's too much for some families to bear. Some marriages don't survive it. Some parents turn to alcohol or drugs to numb the pain. Some people give up on life entirely, going through the motions, but never really living again. But the Christian and Newsom families didn't give up. They got up every day and chose to keep living, keep fighting, keep honoring their children's memories. Dina and Gary Christian's marriage survived when so many don't after the loss of a child. Hugh and Mary Newsom found ways to laugh again, to experience joy again, to believe that life could still have meaning even with the Christopher-shaped hole in their family. That's a victory. That's a testament to the strength of parental love and the resilience of the human spirit. They won because they refused to let the media's initial silence be the final word on their children's importance. When national coverage was absent in 2007, when it seemed like Channon and Christopher would be forgotten outside of Knoxville, the families and their supporters refused to accept that. They kept telling the story. They kept speaking the names. They kept demanding that these deaths receive the attention and outrage they deserved. And eventually the story did reach a wider audience. Not as quickly or extensively as it should have, not with the saturation coverage that other victims received, but enough people heard it, enough people were outraged by it, enough people shared it, that Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom didn't disappear into obscurity. Their names are known. Their story is told. You're hearing it right now, 17 years later, because people refused to let them be forgotten. They won because the work they did made the system slightly more just for others. Dina Christian's advocacy contributed to changes in Tennessee's victims' rights laws. Her willingness to speak uncomfortable truths about media bias forced conversations that needed to happen about which victims receive attention and which don't. Her refusal to let this case be buried made it harder for other cases to be ignored. Every time another family faces the nightmare of losing a loved one to violence, they benefit slightly from the path the Christians and Newsoms helped clear. From the precedents set in court, from the awareness raised about victims' rights, from the example of how to fight for justice even when the system seems designed to re-traumatize you. I started this story by asking you to share this video, to subscribe to this channel, to make sure Channon and Christopher's names are spoken. I'm asking again now at the end, not as clickbait or manipulation, but as an act of remembrance. Every share is a small victory against the silence that tried to bury this story. Every subscription is a commitment to hearing the stories that mainstream media ignores. Every comment is proof that these lives mattered, that their deaths weren't meaningless, that people care. Share this video. Tell someone about Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom. Speak their names. Not to fuel racial division or hatred, the families would hate that, would reject any attempt to use their children's deaths for those purposes. But speak their names as an act of justice, of remembrance, of refusing to accept that some victims matter less than others. The families won because love proved stronger than hate. The people who killed Channon and Christopher were motivated by selfishness, by cruelty, by the complete absence of empathy. And they took what they wanted without caring about the suffering they caused. They destroyed 2 lives without a second thought. That's what hate looks like in its purest form. Not necessarily racial hate, though that may have been present, but hate in the sense of treating other humans as objects to be used and discarded. But the families responded with love. Not love for the killers. That would be absurd and impossible. But love for their children that was so fierce, so enduring, so powerful that it sustained them through a decade of legal battles. Love that transformed into advocacy to help others. Love that created scholarships and memorials and positive change out of negative tragedy. Love that refused to be defeated by hate. That's the victory. That in the face of unimaginable evil, love persisted. That justice, though delayed and tested and forced through retrials, ultimately prevailed. That the family survived and even thrived in their own way, finding purpose in pain, finding meaning in their advocacy work, finding reasons to keep living even when living felt impossible. Lamarcus Davidson had 4 days with Channon Christian. 4 days to inflict all the suffering his evil mind could conceive. 4 days to demonstrate the absolute worst of what humans are capable of doing to each other. 4 days to destroy a young woman's body and try to destroy her humanity. But Dina Christian has had 17 years to honor her daughter. 17 years to speak Channon's name with love. 17 years to ensure that Channon is remembered not for those 4 days of suffering, but for 21 years of life that preceded them. 17 years to show that a mother's love is stronger than a killer's hate. And she'll have many more years to continue that work, to continue speaking Channon's name, to continue ensuring her daughter's life mattered. That's how the families won. 4 days of evil versus decades of love. And love wins. It always does in the end, if we're brave enough to choose it, if we're strong enough to sustain it, if we're committed enough to let it transform our pain into purpose. Christopher Newsom was 23 years old. He was a carpenter who worked with his hands, who was gentle and kind, who treated people with respect. He loved his family. He was starting a relationship with a woman who might have been someone special. He had dreams of starting his own business, of building a good life through honest work. Channon Christian was 21 years old. She was studying sociology because she wanted to help people, wanted to understand how communities work, wanted to make a positive difference in the world. She was loyal to her friends. She loved her parents. She had dreams of graduate school and a career spent helping others. They went to watch a movie on a Saturday night, and they encountered evil in its purest form. They suffered in ways that challenge our understanding of human cruelty. They died young, their potential unfulfilled, their dreams unrealized. But they're not forgotten. Their families made sure of that. I'm making sure of that by telling you their story. And you're making sure of that by watching this video, by sharing it, by speaking their names to others, by refusing to let them disappear into the void of forgotten victims. Rest in peace, Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom. Your families fought for you. They won justice for you. They honored your memories. They transformed their grief into purpose. They survived and even found ways to thrive. They showed the world that love is stronger than hate, that justice can prevail even when delayed, that parents' devotion to their children doesn't end with death. To everyone watching this, share this story, subscribe to this channel, leave a comment saying you were here, that you heard these names, that you refuse to accept that some victims matter less than others. Do it for Channon and Christopher. Do it for their families who fought so hard for so long. Do it because it's right. That's how we win against evil. That's how we always win. By remembering, by demanding justice, by loving so fiercely that not even death can silence us, by refusing to look away from uncomfortable truths, by sharing the stories that need to be told. Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom mattered. Their lives had value. Their deaths demand justice and remembrance. Their families won by ensuring all of that happened. And that victory, hard won and paid for with years of tears and struggle, is real. It's meaningful. It's a testament to what's possible when people refuse to give up, refuse to be silent, refuse to let evil have the final word. Share this story. Speak these names. Remember, that's how we honor the dead. That's how we win.